Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be building the traditional 6-board chest, and I'll be installing the hardware that I made in earlier videos. This chest is actually going to be the toolbox that I bring with me when I'm doing demonstrations at museums and reenactments during the summer. So when I'm setting up, this is going to be the box that's going to carry all my tools to the site, and while I'm demonstrating, it's going to hold my lunch and my cell phone and all the stuff that you really don't want the public to be looking at when you're trying to convince them that it's the 1800s or whatever. Of course, the term 6-board chest refers back to a time when 20-inch wide boards were readily available, so you only needed 6 boards to make a good-sized box. But nowadays, however, you are going to have to make up the 6 panels that you need for this box out of separate boards. If you're careful about your grain selection, you can do a pretty good job of making these glue-ups look like one board. The process is a little tedious, but I think the results are worth it. This is a simple nailed box, and the only joint that you have to cut is a simple rabbet joint on the ends of each of the long boards for the front and the back. This was done for 2 reasons. It really helps to reduce the amount of end grain that you see on the outside of the box, so the box has a much neater appearance. And that shoulder of the rabbet really helps you to position those boards when you're assembling the box. Before I take away the straight edge, I'm setting up a pair of dividers to use as a depth gauge to make sure that the other 3 rabbets are cut to the exact same dimensions. Measuring the depth of the rabbet from the top edge of the straight edge is a lot easier to do than measuring the actual rabbet with the straight edge in the way, and it's quickly done while I'm working. Here you can see how those rabbet joints really help to hold everything together. I don't have anything glued or nailed here, it's just being held together by that one ratchet strap. Now I'm getting ready to nail the box together. The sides of this box are going to be totally held together with rose head nails. I'm not using any glue or any other fasteners here. I'm using this bar clamp to make sure that the sides are pressed right up against the shoulder of that rabbet. The bottom of the box is made out of 2 separate pieces and they're not glued together. The bottom's held in place with screws to make it easier to remove if it ever becomes damaged. Also, this box is going to be carrying a lot of weight, so I don't want the bottom working loose while I'm carrying it around. I'm now ready to install the hardware, and the first thing that I'm going to do is cut the mortise for the lock. And the reason I'm doing that first is because this part of the box is much easier to work on without the lid in place. The lock is actually going to be installed after the lid is in place. I just want to be able to cut the mortise now while I have easy access to the front of the box. The mechanism for the lock needs to be recessed into the front of the box. This straight edge is going to tell me exactly where the back plate for that mechanism is sitting on the box when I'm done lining it up. I want the center of the keyhole to line up exactly with the center of the front of the box, and the hasp needs to be positioned so that the top edge of the hasp just clears the top of the box, but still moves freely in and out of the lock. Once I have that edge of the lock in position, I can remove the lock, mark it, and then repeat the process for the other 3 sides. The top and bottom edge of the mortise for the lock needs to be cut fairly precisely, because if I cut this slot too wide, I'm going to be cutting away the wood that I'm going to need to mount the lock plate to the box. But I am going to be cutting the sides of the mortise a little wide so I can slide the lock from side to side slightly to make any fine adjustments that I need to line the hasp up with the lid. To rough out the mortise, I just drilled several overlapping holes with a Forstner bit and then used a chisel to knock out anything that was left in between the drill holes. You just want to take your time and proceed slowly because the depth of the mechanism is roughly 5/8 of an inch thick and the front panel is only just a shade over 3/4 of an inch, so you don't have a lot of material to play with. Next I'm going to start working on the hinges. And just like I did with the lock, I'm not going to be installing the hinges right now. I just want to cut the mortise that's going to be locking the hinges in place. I didn't position the first hinge at any set distance. I just rested it on the back of the box where I thought it looked good, and then I set a pair of calipers up so that I could transfer that measurement, whatever it was, to the other side of the box. And now I'm using a knife to describe the exact outline of that hinge on the box. The top edge of the hinge needs to be mortised in so that it's just flush with the top edge of the box. If you don't do that, there's going to be a real unsightly gap at the top of the box. Here I'm checking the fit with a scrap piece of wood that's the same thickness as the lid. The part of the hinge that fits inside the box just gets surface mounted. Here I have the hinges just resting in the mortises in the back of the box, and the lid is in position, so I can now mark the location of the strap portion of the hinge on the lid. I need to mortise in the hinges so that the back edge of the hinge can sit flush with the back edge of the lid. Now that the hinges are locked in position by the mortises at the top edge of the box and the back edge of the lid, it's time to turn our attention back to the lock mechanism. The location of the hasp on the inside face of the lid is the last piece of the puzzle that we need to solve before we can start installing the hardware. After taking a few minutes to get the lock exactly where I want it, I need to mark the outside edges of the hasp and exactly where the front face of the box meets the lid. Now I can remove the lid from the box and put it face up on the bench and scribe the location of the hasp on the inside face of the lid. Now we're finally ready to start attaching some hardware. I'm using this clamp to hold the hinge to the top face of the lid and the batten to the bottom face of the lid. The batten needs to be positioned directly underneath the hinge. Ideally it should be parallel to the outside edge, but if your hinge veers off a degree or two one way or another, the batten needs to follow that. So measure as much as you need to and make sure that the center line of the batten is following the center line of the hinge. When you're clenching the nails, always use a small sledge to back up the head of the nail to make sure that the nail doesn't get driven back down while you're bending over the end. And always make sure that you're clenching the nail across the grain of the wood. Once the hinges are nailed in place, I'll nail the hasp to the lid and I'll use the hasp to figure out the location of the lock. Once I get the hasp moving freely in the lock, I can nail it down. The nails I'm using are really small, so I'm not going to bother pre-drilling these. The handles are the last thing to go on, and they get nailed in place the same way everything else did.